Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be painting a flower, and I wanted to give you guys some of my tips on watercolors and how I paint flowers. For this tutorial, you're going to need watercolor brushes, a watercolor pencil crayon, watercolors. I'm using the Winsor & Newton watercolor palette, but I would recommend cheaper watercolors until you know for sure that you like the medium, and then invest in better watercolors later on. Some water, a paper towel, and you will also need watercolor paper. For watercolor paper, you have a choice of hot press and cold press paper. The difference between these two papers is hot press is a lighter, smoother paper, and cold press is a thicker, more textured paper. I prefer to work on cold press, but if you are new to watercolors, I would suggest you try both and see what works for you. This is the reference we're going to be using today. I've attached this image in the description down below in case you wanted to follow along with this tutorial. I've also attached examples of where lights, darks, and midtones are located on my reference, so you can see exactly what I'm talking about when I refer to these specific areas. I like to start by drawing out my image with a watercolor pencil crayon. I focus on trying to get the overall shape of the flower and petals correct. I like to use a neutral color such as burnt sienna or yellow ochre to draw out my image, because it's an easy color to cover up and paint over later. I'm just using a clean watercolor brush and some water to erase any mistakes I may have made in my drawing, and also to refine the shape of my flower. I try to make sure that I'm completely happy with what I've drawn before I move on to the next step. Once I'm happy with my drawing, I move on to mixing my colors. In my palette, you'll notice I don't have a white or a black. For black, I prefer to mix together burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. For my highlights or white areas, I just use the white of the paper, leaving this part of my watercolor paper untouched. The mixing area that I have for my watercolors isn't very large because this is a travel set. However, I found a way to make it work for me. I like to separate my palette into sections of warm colors such as reds and yellows, and cool colors such as blues and greens. In the middle, I like to use this section for black. I start by putting down a base color to cover up my midtones and dark areas. A midtone can be defined as the value between light and dark. A dark tone is the darkest part of my image, and in this case it's the center of the flower. A highlight is the lightest part of my image, which is located on some of the flower petals. While I start this process, I'm careful not to touch any areas that I will be using as my highlights. I leave these areas blank. On your first layer, you're going to want to use a ratio of 10% color and 90% water. This ratio is just a guide to let you know that you should be using mostly water on your first layer. This isn't an exact science, just try your best. One of the reasons it's important to use a lot of water on this layer is in case you make a mistake. It's easier to cover up something that's lighter than it is darker. As I go on to my second layer, I'm using a bit less water and more pigment. At this stage though, I'm still using more water than I am pigment. I like to make sure that my first layer is completely dry before adding more water on top. This way I avoid the colors bleeding together and uneven water spots. Some of the techniques I'm talking about in this video are a little advanced for beginners, but I hope to approach these complicated techniques in ways that everyone can understand. I'm starting to put dark tones now so that I can get more depth in my drawing. I'm still careful not to touch the areas that I've decided will be my highlights. I decided on blue for my background because my flower had a lot of red in it. I felt that blue would cool it down and create a balance of warms and cools. I decided to do another layer on the background because I didn't mix enough blue the first time around. Because I didn't do this, I had to try to mix the exact shade of blue, but quickly before my watercolor dried. This ultimately caused the background to come out uneven and patchy. Always make sure that you mix enough color for what you're painting, and don't do what I just did. I decided I was going to keep some of the little dots on the flower just because I felt like it made it look more natural and realistic. A lot of things come with imperfections, and I felt like it was kind of part of the charm of this flower. At this stage, I'm using less and less water, just mostly the pigment from my watercolor and not as much water because I want my watercolors to be darker at this point. If you make a mistake, you can use paper towel and a clean brush with some water to dab the area. Be careful not to rub too hard with your brush. Something to remember when drawing flowers is that every petal is unique and different from one another. It's unlikely that you'll ever find a flower that is completely symmetrical. While I'm drawing, I try to think about the roundness of a flower petal. At the tip of the petals, you can see that the angles are downward and wrapping around the petal. They then start arching upwards and then sloping downwards towards the center of the flower. Another thing I like to keep in mind when I am painting flowers is that flowers are not perfect. Not every single petal is equal or even the same shape. All of the petals are different shapes. Just like many things in nature, they don't have symmetry. And that's pretty much the end of this video. If you like this video, then give it a like and remember to subscribe to my channel for more art related content. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.